It's one of the most extraordinary moments in Britain's history. Prime Minister Boris Johnson refusing calls from his own cabinet to resign. Nine's Brett McLeod is outside the Prime Minister's residence. Brett, the Queen could be dragged into this mess.
Yeah, this is the site of one of the highest wind speeds ever recorded by man.
Arson could be the cause of a fire at the Sydney home of controversial comedian, commentator and YouTuber Friendly Geordies.
Supine protoplasmic invertebrate jellies.
And to get hot, I got hairy legs that turn turn blonde in the sun.
I will not be lectured about sexism and misogyny by this man.
The decision of one man to launch a wholly unjustified and brutal invasion of Ukraine.
Up yours, woke moralists. We'll see who cancels who.
A proposed law to alter the Constitution to recognise the First Peoples of Australia by establishing an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice. Do you approve this proposed alteration? Hello and welcome to episode 20 of the Fence Sitters podcast, our very special Voice to Parliament episode. We're both a bit dressed up for this one, and I got to admit to you, Will, I'm a little bit nervous. How are you feeling?
No, I'm quite nervous as well. This is probably the most research I've done on any kind of topic in the podcast so far. It's definitely for the 90-something% of our Australian listeners. It's definitely, it is the defining political moment, I feel like, of Australia in a very long time. You could almost argue for all of time. So it's, there's a lot hanging here. There's a lot of detail. There's a lot of nitty-gritty stuff to get into.
Yeah.
And I'm really hoping we make some progress. And I'm still quite undecided myself. So I'm kind of hoping that you'll be able to swing me one way or another, Tiago. That's my genuine hope.
Yeah, well, before we get into things, I just want to say, again, I said this in the last episode, we're not constitutional experts, and we're also not experts in Indigenous communities and the issues that may surround them. So, take, as always, take everything we say with a grain of salt. We're mostly going to be looking at history, legislation, not so much issues and, that would come in an Aboriginal community, and when nothing we say about how this could be interpreted in constitutional law in the High Court should be taken as fact at all, because a lot of people that are a lot more experts than us don't fully understand it either, if you know what I'm saying.
I mean, what we've got is a psychology student and a guy interested in politics who's not even at uni trying their best to figure this whole thing out. That's more or less what you're listening to.
Yeah.
But without further ado, Tiago,
yes.
And just as a little preamble, how are you going? What have you been up to these past few little days?
You know what? I'm doing really well, Will. To be honest, I'm kind of sick about talking about The Voice, because that's, if you're living in Australia, which most of our audience is, that's pretty much all that is being talked about at the moment. Other than that, I've been loving doing my work placement at the youth centre. I feel very at home there. And I've just been, working at the Chinese restaurant, earning the dollars, saving up for a new car. Life's pretty bloody good at the moment. How about you, Will?
I'm good. I ended up working 9 days in a row at my restaurant here, which was quite the adventure. But we pushed through that. I'm just enjoying my time on the island. I've booked some time off in the middle of October to go see some family in Aberdeen.
Oh, nice.
And when the referendum actually happens, I will be in Aberdeen on my time off, so I'll be able to kind of watch it fully as it happens. And also be able to watch the New Zealand general election on the same day.
Oh, very good.
So I can't wait for that one as well. But overall I'm quite happy and content. Okay. So without further ado, I suppose we should...
Could I just bring up one more thing? And it's sort of got to do with what we're talking about today. But Will, I was at the Royal Show the other day. and I walked past the Liberal Party little stall, and they were giving out vote no show bags. So I just thought I'd bring that up. I had quite the laugh at that.
Yeah, we should probably also disclose our affiliations, and I will reveal that I am actually technically still a member of the Liberal Party, even though I haven't paid my membership in I think it's overdue, and so I don't know. But I don't plan to continue to be a member of the Liberal Party simply because I don't live in Australia anymore. But no, that's I don't know. I have mixed feelings about vote no show bags. It doesn't seem like the place where politics should really be infringing.
Yeah, well, I should have picked one up looking back, but I don't know how I would feel about walking around the rest of the Royal Show holding a vote no show bag.
Was anyone using them?
It looked like they had a full table worth of them, so.
There you go.
Yeah.
There you go. How much were they? $20.
I think they were free. I'd hope so. I'd hope they were free.
I hope they were free. Okay. Well, without further ado, let's get into some stuff.
Yeah.
So, for people who don't know, for a very small portion of a non-Australian audience, and possibly for a large portion of our Australian audience, we are mostly dealing here with a very fundamental question of Australian identity and of the identity of Australia in regards to the Indigenous peoples of Australia. So currently, Indigenous Australians make up 3.2% of the Australian population. They are looked upon widely by academics in the world as the longest surviving continuous kind of cultural group still in existence, which is an incredible feat and something which I think is quite underestimated and not looked upon by the world enough. Estimates kind of put it in between 60,000 to 70,000 years of continuous oral traditions, continuous hunter-gathering practices, cave paintings, musical instruments. I mean, the whole range of things. It's really quite incredible. And that also extends to language. So in the 2022 census, there was thought to be 167 different Indigenous languages, which again is quite incredible. At the time of colonization, 1788, there was 250 different languages, but of course a large number of them have died off and are still dying off, which is quite sad. But yeah, the Aboriginal people of Australia are an incredibly interesting, diverse, Indigenous group, which are, they're quite incredible. So I don't know. I mean, what do you make of them, Tiago?
Yeah, no, I think it's an often, we learn about it in primary school, the stories and all that, but there's so much to so many cultures, so many groups, so many different traditions and that sort of stuff that make up, well, I guess it's such a large portion of land, and I think, as you said, it's overlooked. I think maybe we should know more about what sort of traditions and cultural phenomenons and stuff happen in the Indigenous group that are in the areas that we live in Australia, obviously. And yeah, I think if nothing else, I think it's super cool that it still happens, and I personally find it very interesting and quite important.
I'll also add that it's the Aboriginal and also Torres Strait Islanders.
That's correct. Yeah.
And so the Torres Strait Islanders, for listeners who also don't know, are again another group of Indigenous Australians, I suppose, which are found on a number of islands in between the northern tip of Queensland and Papua New Guinea. And they have a more kind of Pacific Papua New Guinea orientated culture, but are still within the Australian boundaries. And so all of that aside, there is a very, very dark and quite haunting side to the history of the Indigenous peoples in regards to Australia, which frankly is just a simple fact in regards to the history of colonization. So yeah, I mean, it was just, you know, when European settlers came, there was a general practice of settlement, frontier wars, killings, and expansion against the Aboriginal people, which were obviously not in their favour. Several diseases came from Europeans, which went rife through Aboriginal populations and completely obliterated their numbers. I think a horrific fact is that the only successful genocide anywhere in the world actually occurred in Tasmania. So Tasmania, obviously an island off the south of Australia, is the only place where literally all of the Aboriginals were wiped out there by European settlers. And so that's going from 1788 onwards with European arrivals. And I mean, even in modern, you know, semi-modern history, with what people would look on to as modern history, there were quite some horrible practices. For example, the stolen generation. Would you like to talk about the stolen generation?
Yeah, so thinking back a bit to year 6 history here, but from my understanding of what the stolen generation was the idea that if you are an Indigenous person who is part white European, you're not fit to be with Indigenous people, you're fit to be in the more civilized white society. So they were taken away from their families and brought to like camps to be put into other white families, basically to be integrated into European society.
Assimilated, yeah. It was a systemic government assimilation program.
Yeah.
Forcibly taking Indigenous children to white families to genetically more or less wipe out the Aboriginal populations by assimilating children into the mainstream white population. And that was happening in the mid 20th century, which is frankly mind-boggling.
Yes.
So,
it
is
to add, when we talk about intergenerational trauma, a lot of people kind of roll their eyes like, how does that exist? But I mean, it's real, and this stuff, as you just said, it wasn't happening that long ago. Like, there are people alive today that quite clearly remember this sort of stuff happening.
There are people alive today who are members of the stolen generation still, obviously. It's a colossal fact. And that was a process of systemic government assimilation based upon genetics. Which, when you put it in those terms, which is what it was, is really quite a freaky thing. In regards to a bit more history, Aboriginal people were only recognised around 1967 with the 1967 referendum, which provided them voting rights and also allowed the Australian government to legislate on behalf of them. Before then, I think this is what it was, that they were actually classed under flora and fauna. And again, you know, animals and plants. I mean, that was 1967. Like, my parents were actually alive at that point in time.
It's...
it's really quite incredible. And so from 1967, with that referendum, there's kind of been a gradual inclination uphill in regards to reconciliation and promotion of Aboriginal rights, until we've kind of accumulated at this thing called the Uluru Statement. Which would you like to go into the Uluru Statement a little bit, Tiago?
Yes. So basically, when we talk about Indigenous issues and we talk about how they're still in Australia to now, we often talk about this thing called the gap, and the gap is the distance in how well off, in general, the Indigenous population is in terms of education, levels of imprisonment, health, all that sort of stuff, in comparison to the wider Australian population. And the idea of this Uluru meeting, that it happened at Uluru, obviously, was a lot of, I guess, elders and experts from all these Aboriginal communities around Australia came together and thought, what is the best way we can go about closing the gap? And amongst other things, including like continuing this tradition, continuing the culture and all that stuff, importantly to what we're talking about today, they brought up this idea of an Indigenous voice to Parliament, which I mean, we'll get into it, but their basic outlining was this would be an advisory board that would be able to be consulted by the government and give advice to the government on issues that directly impact Indigenous people. So when this first happened, the Liberals were in power, the Liberal government, and their initial decision was to not go ahead. Important to note, they wanted this voice to be constitutionally enshrined, which is for reasons we'll get into in a moment, I'm sure. But the Liberals didn't want to put this in place. I mean, holding a referendum is not cheap. They had big questions about, what this would mean in terms of how this would be interpreted constitutionally, how we would actually implement it into the constitution, that sort of stuff. And, a lot of the Liberal voting base when polled, were against it. So it makes sense why they wouldn't have wanted to do it. But, I guess that sort of brings us up to election promises today, or...
Well, I was going to say that. So the Uluru Statement from the Heart. Voice was. There were kind of three pillars to it.
Mm-hmm.
So the Voice was obviously one pillar, that constitutionally enshrined advisory body. Another pillar was treaty. So there's a lot of talk about an official treaty between the kind of sovereign Commonwealth of Australia and the ideas of the sovereign Indigenous people who were here before Australia. So that treaty is the second pillar, and then truth is the third pillar, which again is a general a national kind of idea of reconciliation and awakening and acknowledgement of the truth in the past of what happened in regards to what Tiago and I just somewhat summarized. But the Voice is what we're dealing with today, and it's what Australia will be dealing with on the 14th of October.
Yes.
So, yes, and Tiago was talking there about election promises, which kind of brings us to the next point, is that in the May 2022 Australian federal election, Anthony Albanese and his Labor Party put in the idea of the Voice as a fundamental aspect of the election manifesto.
Yeah.
They then won the 2022 May Australian federal election. Anthony Albanese became Prime Minister, and the idea of a constitutionally enshrined voice referendum kind of took off the ground. It's been in development ever since. It was kind of earlier this year, around February and March, that the government started really refining and releasing their constitutional kind of proposals. That was then officially released to give people time to look into it and legal experts to analyze it earlier this year. And we've now, on the 14th of October, we'll be having the referendum on whether it should be accepted.
Yeah.
Do you want to add anything to that before I fully go through line by line what's being presented here, Tiago?
No, I think that's a good summary of it. I mean, we'll go through strategies and stuff later in the show, I think. But yeah, in terms of the facts, I don't have anything to add. Okay.
Alrighty. So without further ado, for all our listeners, I will go through the what's actually being proposed, because it's very important. So on your referendum little slip, the referendum question will go as follow: a proposed law to alter the constitution to recognise the First Peoples of Australia by establishing an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice. Do you approve this proposed alteration? And the alteration is as follows. So the proposed law would change the constitution by inserting the following text after Chapter 8. So this is, if that all sounds a bit complicated, pretty much you're saying yes or no to this following paragraph being inserted into the official Australian Constitution and creating a new chapter. So this would be Chapter 9 of the Australian Constitution, Recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Peoples, 129, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice, and it goes like this. In recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the first peoples of Australia, There shall be a body to be called the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Voice. The Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Voice may make representations to the Parliament and the Executive Government of the Commonwealth on matters relating to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. The Parliament shall, subject to this Constitution, have power to make laws with respect to matters relating to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Voice, including its composition, functions, powers, and procedures. And that is pretty much it. So that is the beef of the argument, and that is what will be put into the Constitution. And so that kind of leads us to our next question, which is, what does this voice actually look like? How does it function, and all of that kind of stuff? So do you want to go into that a little bit, Tiago?
Yeah, so from my understanding, the voice as itself is going to be a body of, and I think what's officially been said is, of representatives from various Indigenous communities that have been chosen by those Indigenous communities to represent issues from those Indigenous communities. You know, if I say Indigenous communities one more time, my head's going to explode. But so, and then that body will then be able to, if a law's going or a bill's going through Parliament, and it will somehow, if they decide that it's going to somehow affect Indigenous people, they are able to then go to the government and say, hey, this is going to affect this. Could you either, we would recommend that you change this, get rid of this, add this, whatever, so that it can benefit or prevent harm from occurring to these various communities. That's how I understand it being able to work. I think they may also be able to implement things that they suggest that the government implements laws that will also positively affect or prevent harm from their communities as well. Again, there's nothing in this to say that the government has to listen to them. They are an advisory board or an advisory group. But, you know, we'll get into it, but it would be kind of a bad look for them to flat out ignore what they're saying.
Yeah. So just to kind of do a quick rundown of the official governmental handbook of how the voice will kind of work. It's a more of an abstract kind of idea put forward as to what it will look like. So yeah, as Tiago said, it'll be an independent advisory body, simply around to provide guidance and advice specifically to Parliament and government. And the voice will be chosen by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people based on the wishes of local communities. And some really important things which I want to put in is that the voice will be accountable and transparent. So voice members would fall within the scope of the National Anti-Corruption Commission. So that's kind of a governmental watchdog, which makes sure that government, organizations like the voice and similar to the voice maintain accountability and transparency. The voice will not have a program delivery function. So for all of our lovely little bits of political jargon, a program delivery function simply means it doesn't have a budget, it doesn't have any money, it can't actually implement physical things on the ground. It can simply come up with ideas and put them forward. And to finish off, and this is quite an important one, the voice will not have a veto power. It can't veto anything. Parliament and the people through Parliament are, and always will be, well, hopefully, sovereign. And that's really quite important. And so without further ado, Tiago, should we perhaps bang heads and get into the nitty and the gritty of whether this is a good or bad or mediocre thing? Do you want to start off with your general argument, idea, and perhaps which way you plan to vote if you want to reveal something?
We've been very objective. I'm just going to sort of state my opinion outright. I feel like this whole thing has been a bit of a fustercluck, to be perfectly honest. I will be voting yes, to be completely transparent. I think there has been a lot of deliberate manipulation of what has been proposed, a lot of misinformation, disinformation, whatever we call it these days, about what the bill actually is. A lot of wild accusations thrown around, like, there's nothing in this to say that they can't form their own house of government. Crazy things like that. That really frustrate me when it comes to this, and I think it's a real shame. We'll get into later that this is probably not going to pass. But Will, what are your thoughts?
Oh boy. So I've been dealing more or less only with this issue in my little bits of free time for the past 4 or 5 days. And it has really almost kind of torn me to shreds. So I think so. It's an interesting one. As myself as a conservative, and in favor of small gradual change, I was initially generally against it. Mm-hmm. I thought that I thought that actually altering and changing the constitution permanently could be a very, very dangerous thing, and that we should be very wary before we do any of that, and that once it's in, it's permanent, we can't alter it, and that there's a reason that so many referendums have failed in the past, and that's so I had all of those ideas. I also had this idea of Australia being a liberal democratic state, and the fundamental core idea of that liberal democratic state is that you can't, and I've been toying with this idea most recently today and yesterday, is that you shouldn't be able to you shouldn't be able to racialize the constitution, so that in regards to liberal democracy with equality for everyone, no one should be kind of pinpointed out within the constitution to bring them higher or above than anyone else. And so that was my initial kind of idea, and I was looking into lots of different advisory bodies which already exist. Yep. For example, the National Indigenous Australians Agency, which currently has 1,400 staff and a budget of $4.3 billion. And I mean, there are hundreds, literally hundreds of different councils, advisory bodies, committees all around the country which are working towards closing the gap and progressing the Indigenous people of Australia. But looking into it more and more and more, I've come to more and more side with it in a very kind of restricted way. And I want to hear your thoughts about this, Tiago, and I also kind of want to talk to people who are thinking of voting no. Like I can't vote, by the way, at the moment. I won't be voting in this, but I originally thought I would be voting no if I could, but now I'm thinking the other way, and I want to talk to people in that regard. And I also want to tap into what you were saying about scare tactics and misinformation. This whole idea about not knowing what it's going to look like, the vagueness of it, the powers it has, and the general idea that everything is so far up in the air that we shouldn't implement it, I think you're starting on the wrong premise. It's a misguided accusation to make. The government was never going to put forward a fully proposed idea of what the voice was before we were going to vote on it. And I know that sounds weird and doesn't make any sense. Why would you buy a car before you haven't checked out the car? Why would you buy a house before you haven't had a walk around the house? People have been making those assertions, but it's a different kind of thing. And the reason for this is because it's such a complicated and messy process, and because it has to go through Parliament, it makes sense that has to get the go-ahead before it's actually developed through Parliament. And for people who think, right, well, we give it the go-ahead, we give it the green light, and suddenly it's given off to all these politicians, and they come up with some crazy radical thing, which is then permanently put into the government. I would counter that proposal. Firstly, in regards to the ideas of the liberal democratic state I was talking about, Parliament is the exact democratic symbolic embodiment of the people. For the idea that Parliament will then develop through a bill, if this is accepted, Parliament will develop the voice through a bill in Parliament. It will go through the House of Representatives. It will go through several committee stages. It will then be voted in the House of Representatives. It will then go to the Senate. It will go through several committee stages. It will then be voted to the Senate. If the Senate doesn't like something, it'll go back to the House of Reps. House of Reps doesn't like something, it'll go back to the Senate. This is going to take, quite frankly, I wouldn't be surprised if it takes years of debate, of ideas, of nitpicking, of legal implications, of professors, of intelligent people from all around the world and all within Parliament coming together. Also, Indigenous members of Parliament, currently, as we said, 3% of Australia is Indigenous, and so they're actually technically overrepresented in Parliament, so there will be an Indigenous democratic representation into the development of this within Parliament. The point is, it will go through a very, very, very strident, precise procedure, which is democratically enshrined by the very fact that Parliament is doing it. And once it gets through all of that, it'll get to the Governor-General. They'll sign off on it, and then the voice will be established. So in that regard, I want to quell conservatives who are scared of some radical thing suddenly being put into our constitution forever. I want to quell the idea that that will happen, because the point is, I don't think once this system comes through Parliament, I don't think it will be that radical. I think with all the scrutiny, with all of the checks and balances, with the Liberals having a decent amount of stopping power within the Senate, I think there's quite a large political transparency which will be put into the development of this thing. I mean, what do you think about that, Tiago?
No, you're absolutely right, and you've really kind of put into words what I have been thinking when talking to people about this, where it's like, they've given a fair bit of information with it. Importantly, that it does not have veto power, which is another thing that people seem to just be sort of ignoring. But you're right, it needs to still go through all these processes and all these checks and balances that are deliberately put in place as a part of our functioning democracy in order for it to get through. It's a bill like any other, it's constantly enshrined, but it needs to go under the same scrutinies, and probably, if not more, because this is such a big deal.
Definitely more.
So I think it is a little naive to say, oh, well, we don't have all the information, how are we supposed to make a decision on this? Our elected officials, who are the ones, who have we'd hope have the best understanding in a functioning democracy of who they represent and what different things mean, will be able to make these decisions and scrutinize each other and debate about it and come to a decision that hopefully, ideally, would be the right one for everyone.
Furthermore, because I really want to hammer home on this point. I can still see. I mean, obviously, I have lots of friends who fall onto the more conservative right, and friends within the Liberal Party. And I remember talking to one of them and about the fact that there will then be this permanent enshrined thing within the Constitution, and people could object to what I've just said and what you've just kind of confirmed, Tiago, by saying, okay, so it's just like a bill, it's like any other bill, it's just going through Parliament. That's fine. I completely accept that, and it will be scrutinised as much as it possibly can. But they might still object by saying, but it's still going to be permanent in the Constitution, which is different from any other bill, which usually really occurs. And my response to that is, well, okay, but if you look at what's being enshrined into the Constitution, the wording here is very, very important. So, sentence 3, the Parliament shall, subject to this Constitution, have power to make laws with respect to matters relating to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice including its composition, functions, powers, and procedures. Which means that whenever an issue arises with the voice, Parliament will be able to step in and will be able to legislate with a snap of its fingers. If Parliament, if the voice objects to something which it probably shouldn't do, if the voice puts forward too many legal challenges, if the voice steps out of line in regards to commenting on defence or national security, Parliament will always have sovereignty. Parliament will always have power to make laws with respect to matters relating to the voice. It has general powers to legislate about the voice at any point in time. So if a problem arises, it will be able to legislate against that problem. The voice doesn't have veto powers. Parliament and that kind of level of executive will have veto powers over the voice. So to quell the worry that once this thing's enshrined in the Constitution, we can never change it, that's again, you're starting from the wrong premise. It's like the fundamental, there's an idea enshrined in the Constitution, but what that idea is actually practically manifested as is that can be changed. That can be changed by our democratically elected Parliament whenever. You know what I mean?
Yeah, definitely.
Which is, again, a fundamental point which should really be hammered home. And one I've been trying to get my head around and get to grips with. I really, for the Conservatives out there, I really want to make that point. And again, if anyone listening to this has any objections, please write in.
Yeah, no, we will definitely spend
emails or whatever.
A decent amount of either next episode or the one after going through what people have said if we get sent enough stuff. So that would be really good and valuable.
Please write in.
Yeah.
So we've got all of that. I have quite a lot of other stuff that I've kind of got bubbling in my head, but do you have anything else, Tiago, you'd like to kind of add in regard to that?
I was going to ask your thoughts on this, and again, I'm not a constitutional expert, and I know you're not, but if, for whatever reason, this goes through, we've talked about how Parliament does have veto power over it, but they keep trying things, they keep, for whatever reason, trying to act as if they have more power than they don't. Could not a political party then run on another constitution to get rid of the referendum to get rid of the voice? Yeah.
Well, this is have you heard the idea of Peter Dunn playing around with the second referendum?
Yeah, I have. Yeah, a little bit.
Yeah. So this is the really interesting thing about referendums in politics, is that you really have to be careful with referendums because you are bypassing the Parliament. So having referendums in like a fully parliamentary democracy can be really dangerous. And we've seen that with Brexit in the UK. Because, if the referendum doesn't go your way, it's like, well, when do we hold another referendum to see if the people want to change their idea again? You see it with Scottish independence. It's like, well, the referendum did not go our way. Well, we want to hold another one. It's like, well, that's not how it works. And then it's like, well, how does it work? So there is, so this idea of a government running on another referendum to then alter the Constitution in regard to say if the voice was enshrined in the Constitution, that could definitely happen. There is no precedent of that not happening. There's no rules in the Constitution to say you can't have a referendum on a thing in the Constitution again. So it could quite easily happen. I just, my hope would be that say it passes, it gets put in, and then the public and politicians kind of give it 5 years to a decade to test it out, and then if it really goes radically wrong, then maybe a referendum would come around which tries to alter what's been written into the Constitution. But I don't think, again, with what I was saying before about Parliament having the power to alter that, because it's such a vague idea, Parliament can create the specifics. I think that will hopefully solve that problem. But to answer your question, technically, yes, another party could run on a second referendum, which is, it's very interesting, that idea. Anything else you kind of want to
not in terms of that. I'm interested to see where you want to go from here. So in regards to the conservatism of the dangers of us voting for something we don't understand, I've kind of just explained hopefully why
we shouldn't be worried about that. I then, something which, and this is my really main ticking point, which I find really hard to deal with, and which I've been trying to look at other national variations to kind of counter, is this idea I touched on before of a liberal democracy being completely race blind in regard to the idea that if you want complete proper equality, you shouldn't be pickpocketing particular racial groups of people and promoting them within the constitution above other groups of people. Because, I mean, in regards to the simple facts of democracy, that doesn't make sense. You can have, sorry, not democracy, equality. You can have a blank race-blind constitution, which obviously is what Australia has at the moment. But then underneath that, you can have advisory bodies, you can have committees, you can have charities, you can have as many kind of things, institutions you possibly can to try and close that gap. But in regards to the constitution, that should be race blind. That's the kind of bedrock which everyone is equally built up from, if you understand what I mean.
Yeah.
And I've been dealing with this idea, and it currently is the thing which makes me most want to vote no. But I thought, well, hold on a second. Let's actually look into what other countries have been doing here. And it's quite stark in almost revealing how far behind Australia is in regards to other countries around the globe doing racial kind of reconciliation. And I really wanted to hammer home this part as well. So Norway, they currently have an elected. So Norway, they have this indigenous group called the Sami people. The Sami people are they're native to kind of northern Scandinavia. They go through Norway, Sweden, Finland. They even go a little bit into Russia. And the Norwegian government actually has a miniature kind of parliament specifically for the Sami people. And the Norwegian government is constitutionally obliged to actually consult the Sami people, which, if you think about it, is
step
more
further than what we've got proposed.
further than us, right? Further than what we're putting forward here. In the Voice, it's simply advisory. In Norway, the government has to legally oblige this Sami parliament. In New Zealand, obviously with the Maoris, and again quite close to us, so really quite interesting to look at the comparison. There are actually seats, parliamentary seats, in the New Zealand Parliament which are reserved for Maoris. Which again,
that's way further than
way further than what we're presenting here. And those Maori seats have been reserved for decades now. It's been an enshrined part of New Zealand's unwritten constitution for quite a while. And as far as I can find researching it, there's no objections to it. Their democracy is flourishing quite well, as we'll also see on the 14th of October. Looking into the Norwegian Sami parliament, that seems to be working quite well. No real conflicts of power there. Their judiciary service is still working well. And this is kind of what really switched it for me, was Canada. So Canada has an interesting relationship with their Indigenous people. So there's kind of three different groups within Canada. You've got the First Nations people within Canada. You've got the Métis people. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, but METIS. And then you've got the Inuit people. So they're all kind of branches of Native Americans within Canada. And there's a number of advisory, kind of constitutional advisory bodies. The Nunavut people have their own miniature parliament. There's fiduciary responsibility, which is a new word I found, fiduciary. Fiduciary, if you don't know, it's kind of a legal jargonistic term. It more or less means responsibility, like a legal responsibility. So the Canadian government has fiduciary to these Indigenous people. And then this is the part I really want to hammer home, is that within the Canadian Constitution, there is a chapter, part 2 of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which is in the 19th Canadian Constitution, which explicitly outlines the rights of Canadian Indigenous people, and it recognizes the rights of Canadian Indigenous people. It recognizes their original sovereignty. It recognizes their original point and purpose within the land of Canada. And that's been in the Canadian Constitution since 1982, and nothing has it hasn't infringed upon the rights of anyone. It hasn't distorted that kind of liberal extreme equality I was talking about before. It hasn't caused any conflicts so far. It seems to have been in regards to a symbolic respectful recognition of those people in the kind of birth document of that nation. It seems to have worked. It seems to be functioning well. So in regards to that idea of a constitution being absolutely race blind, I mean, I'd love to find objections to what I'm putting forward, but I've found several examples across the world where the constitution actually isn't technically race blind, but it doesn't disrupt that level of equality. I mean, do you have any thoughts on that, Tiago? Or
I mean, in terms of countries that have been colonized that have...
I've just lost your sound there.
Oh, sorry. Note down the time so we can cut this out.
No, I can't hear you.
Hello.
No, I think, are you muted? Did you mute yourself?
Okay.
Is it on Discord? There's a...
Can you hear me now? Can you hear me here?
Yes, I can.
Okay, cool. So,
sorry about that.
Sorry about that.
Sorry.
In terms of, countries that have been colonized and have had indigenous people... Sorry, I've lost my train of thought a bit here, but... On the ground, when we think of countries like that have flourishing democracies, these are countries that we look to, It's interesting what you're saying. And I think, yes, in an idealistic world, in a world where, the only reason that Indigenous people make up 3% of the population was because there's just so much less of them. Nothing to do with the fact that they were slaughtered or killed and, got diseases and all that sort of stuff. Let's make it blind, but we have to be kind of realistic here. There is a problem here, like a big problem, and I think in a way we need to recognize that these people have been terribly affected by things that have happened, and that's why they don't make up as much of our voting base. So that's why they don't have as much power. And that's why they kind of need to be given some sort of leg up to get their issues heard. And I just think it's a kind of naive thing to say, and while still kind of theoretically right in some way, that the Constitution needs to be, or our laws in general need to be completely blind to race. And I think what quells that fear even more is what you've just said about there are plenty of other well-functioning democracies around the world, or what we would consider well-functioning democracies around the world, that recognize their Indigenous people to a much larger degree.
Much extended degree, yeah.
This kind of seems like almost the minimum we could be doing if we were looking at this way of solving things or closing the gap, so to speak. But yeah.
Another point I wanted to make, which will probably be my kind of final remark on this whole idea of a race-blind constitution, is that in regards to having a constitution fully based on race-blind equality, in regards to like a nation state, that's fine if your nation state has appeared out of thin air. And so, or your nation state is a quote unquote kind of original. So, for example, you look at the nation of Japan, you look at the nation of the United Kingdom, you look at, say, Germany. It's like the Japanese constitution, the unwritten British constitution, that the kind of Germanic peoples, those nation states, the development of those constitutions, written or unwritten, were all kind of based upon that founding people group, say the Anglo-Saxons in the UK, the Germans in Germany, the Japanese in Japan. But it makes sense for those, how do I put this? It makes sense for those constitutions to be fully equal and fully race blind because they are the only people who've ever been there.
Yeah.
But there is a difference. There is a fundamental difference when you are developing a constitution.
You're exactly right.
On land where there has been, and I'm trying to frame this in a way which perhaps conservatives would kind of then begin to understand. You're developing a constitution not like Japan, Britain, or Germany, where you're the only racial group that's ever been there. You're developing a constitution of a nation state, literally upon another sovereign nation state. That being the indigenous sovereign peoples of the Aboriginals.
Yeah.
And that to me is why we must in this scenario over here then recognize this other state which was actually there before us. In Britain, Japan, Germany, South America, Africa, in those countries where you're writing a constitution where you're based around a central people group which has always been there, that's fine. You don't have to kind of write out a specific thing. But when you've had another nation state and you're building a kind of separate thing on top of that, it makes sense in my eyes to then recognize that underlying thing out of courtesy, out of respect, out of the necessary conditions of the fact that you're building on top of another thing.
And if you want to talk about being conservative, I mean, what's the thousands and thousands of years of culture before? You know that.
Well, exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, that's as a conservative, you can. And this directly falls into my line of kind of small c conservatism, is the idea of enshrining tradition and respecting ritual and all of those glorious things which the Indigenous Australians are just so massively rich within, and which are quite incredible. So I really hope, to my fellow conservatives out there, I've tried to kind of, I don't know, tried to point out what's happening here, and tried to explain through my thought process as to why this isn't as radical as people think, why it's not going to bring a massive amount of crisis and bureaucracy to the government, and why you can actually have fully functioning liberal Western democracies with a constitution which isn't technically race blind, because you're building a constitution upon another sovereign people who were there before you. It's really, and that final point there about the whole race blind thing, I would really, if people want to challenge me on that, please do, because I'm wrestling with it a lot. And it kind of brings me to conclude that if I was in Australia, I think I would vote yes.
Right.
Yeah.
All right.
I'm not fully happy with it, but I just, in regards to change needing to be made, it's the settling for the best kind of thing.
Yeah.
Anything you want to challenge me on? I feel like we haven't really clashed as much as
I thought we were going to more. Let me have a think.
I mean, if we talked about it like 2 days ago, we probably would have. But I've kind of had those clashes in my head and tried to figure out everything I could. And this is honestly my genuine kind of conclusion.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, I'm curious, Tiago. There's a lot of Indigenous people themselves who are in favour of no, and this, I think, if we want to kind of go on to the more polling side of things, it's fascinating.
Sure.
Because
I actually really wanted to talk about this. When we actually look at Indigenous people being polled as a whole, obviously, you know, it's not necessarily representative of all Indigenous people. This is Indigenous people that are clued into politics enough to participate in polls. But we get to see that 80 to 83% of Indigenous people are actually in favour of the voice. And I think it's been a very, very clever decision by the No campaign to get these Indigenous people that are members of the Liberals Party, the National Party, and various other organisations to come out and say, no, I don't want this. I don't think it's beneficial for my community. Because I think that makes the person who was genuinely concerned about what this referendum could mean, but kind of felt a bit guilty about it, you know what I mean? Kind of quelled that a little bit for them. But I do not think that those voices that are being really, really propped up in the media and really, really propped up by the No campaign are at all representative of the wider Indigenous community. As I said, polling, we're looking at 80 to 83% wanting it. The idea in the first place was developed by a group of Indigenous people representing a wide variety of communities. When you go out and you actually talk to a lot of Indigenous people, they're all for it. I think, again, it's a smart political move. I don't think it actually is representative of the overall majority of Aboriginal people. But did you have a thought on that, Will?
I mean, I was more talking on Indigenous people being like, I mean, because it kind of, it almost, you've got like a curve, and there's people on completely either end of the spectrum who are voting no because they either think it's not going far enough or it's going too far.
Yeah.
Which I think if we want to get onto the general polling is why this will probably fail.
Yeah.
Overall is, and why referendums fail so much is because it's such a binary choice.
Yeah.
If you don't like it because you don't like it because it's going too far, or you can not like it because it's not going too far enough and you want something else. You know, in regards to really difficult questions which flourish on compromise and togetherness and kind of split and fall away when it's a binary question, this is definitely one of those things. And yeah, I mean, I know I watched a Four Corners report, and there was an Indigenous man there whose name escapes me. He was a younger guy, a cricketer with like the hat and the mustache and everything.
Oh, I think I've seen clips from it.
Yeah. And he was going on about how it was kind of an outrage that it was, you know, a white settler majority country coming in, using a white settler kind of Western liberal referendum kind of system, and then actually going to the sense of, you know, kind of offering the voice, which doesn't even go further enough, like far enough. And he was just completely outraged at that, and saw it as offensive and an insult.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of Indigenous people who are really quite activist in trance will be voting no because it doesn't go far enough. But and this is going to be horrible to say, but it's like, well, if you do want progress, if you want change,
you have to start somewhere, don't you?
You have to start somewhere.
This isn't the last step to closing the gap, right? This is... No. There needs to be so much more done, but this is a step, right? This is a step in the right direction towards something, using our institutions that are well built in this country to start closing the gap, to get actual voices of people into Parliament. I think, and I heard this a bit from, you know, Greens representatives as well, of being like, well, this doesn't go far enough, so I'm going to vote no. And it's like...
Lydia Thorpe.
She's an independent, I think. Ex-Greens independent, yeah.
She quit the Greens.
Yeah, she was kicked out, I think.
Yeah. This is a massive Republican. But anyway.
What was I saying? But yeah, it's a step in the right direction. And if you're voting no, what message is that really going to send? It's going to send, all right, we need to reduce this even more, I think. More than it's going to send, we need to do more. Do you understand what I'm saying, Will? Yeah. I think it's a little, and again, I cannot speak for Aboriginal people on behalf of any Aboriginal communities whatsoever, but I think it is a bit naive to say, oh, we can't do this because it's not far enough. It's like if there was a bill for a windmill farm to be built, and you said, no, we're not going to build that windmill farm because that doesn't make Australia 100% reliable on green energy. It's like, no, it doesn't, but it's a step towards that. Do you know what I mean? Yeah.
Yeah, it is interesting. I mean, what do you make of the whole argument that it's just another level of bureaucracy which isn't going to get anything done and is just wasting more taxpayers' money? And that there's already enough kind of committees and things around. And this is something I wanted to look into more before I came to this, but I didn't. But I really want to know if you know anything more about this. But there are also are there not more local voices? Like within Victoria, within Western Australia, within the states and territories?
Yeah, I think there are. Again, they're not constitutionally enshrined, but they're enshrined. But there are voices to local councils, and I think even maybe the Northern Territory government. I could be wrong, so fact check me on that. But yeah, that is a thing, and I should have looked into how effective those were. But again, in saying that, yeah, it's going to maybe cost the taxpayers a bit of money to get this off the ground. But once it's going, it's not going to be this big draining cost on the economy. That I've been made aware of anyway. And I think, again, you could say maybe it's not going to do very much. I think it's, again, naive to say they won't do anything because, again, we're getting these Indigenous voices into Parliament that wouldn't otherwise be there. But in saying that, maybe it's not 100% worth it, but it's also a step, as I said before. It is a step in the right direction, in my opinion.
Yeah, so I mean, all of that covered, to our general listening base, in regards to the polls and what's probably going to happen, it doesn't look like it's going to pass.
No.
So, for those of you who don't know, it is very difficult to get a referendum through in Australia. We've had 44 kind of questions put forward over our time as a nation, and only 8 have succeeded.
Yeah.
So for this to succeed, Australia has an interesting thing called a double majority, which there are 2/3 majorities elsewhere in the world, but I actually don't know another country in the world which does this specific double majority mechanism, where you obviously need 50% plus 1 of the overall, so that's over 50% of the overall national vote, and then you need over 50% in 4 of the 6 states. So to kind of summarize that, it means you have all of Australia 1 by 1 voting, but then states kind of combined, you also have a majority of the states coming as well, which is good because, obviously, theoretically, all of Western Australia could vote against. If you didn't have that state thing, all of Western Australia, all of South Australia, and probably all of Queensland could vote, and Tasmania could probably vote against it, and then New South Wales and Victoria, all of them could vote for it, and it would still pass. And New South Wales and Victoria would bring the whole country with them.
Yeah.
So that mechanism enforces equality amongst the states. Yeah. But because of it, all you need is 3 states to vote against, and it's immediately cancelled.
Yeah.
I don't know the specific polling amongst the states, but I'd imagine Queensland probably isn't really that much in favour. I doubt. It's like Queensland, South Australia, New South Wales.
Yeah.
Oh no, Queensland, WA, South Australia. I would imagine they're probably not that in favour. In regards to, I mean, I don't know. It's, yeah.
I think this is almost purely. If you would have asked me, even 2-3 months ago, will this go through? Yeah, I think it will. Ask me in the last month or so, there's no way. I mean, since this has more come into the public conscience, since the date's been set, the No campaign, which I'm going to call it that because a lot of groups are part of it, has just become really strong. I mean, you watch TV in Australia and if you're in here, up here, down here, wherever we are, well, you watch TV, you watch YouTube, you watch anything that has ads on it, I've seen a billion, vote no, vote no, vote no. And as I was remarking to you yesterday over messages, about 1 in 10 ads or pieces of news coverage or anything like that, any general media recommended videos in YouTube are vote yes. So it does seem like there's this really strong no push. And to help them out almost, Albo keeps kind of flundering the yes campaign itself.
Yeah, he does, doesn't he?
Yeah. I mean, when he sort of first bringing this in, there was this baffling decision. Shaquille O'Neal, the basketball player, was in Australia for a sports bet ad, and Albo thought this would be a great opportunity to get him to come and speak and say, "Vote yes on this referendum."
He's a black American
man, and I think that put a bad taste in a lot of people's mouths from the very beginning.
Was really weird.
It was just a really strange decision on his behalf. I mean, him or his people or whatever, but you know what I mean.
I think this will be the first major stuff up of the Albanese government. Really.
Yeah, definitely. I would agree
handling
with
of this
that.
whole referendum.
Mm-hmm.
But I will agree. He seemed Albo. He doesn't have control of the narrative.
No, not at all.
His ad campaign isn't really taking off the ground.
No.
It's I don't really know. He seemed.
He's also. You
go, Tiago.
Okay. He seems to. Oh my god. He seems to be not really addressing a lot of the issues people are having. I haven't seen one press conference of him coming out and being like, well, they don't have veto power, or something as simple as that. Like, they're not that powerful.
Yeah.
He needs to come out and say this sort of stuff, or people are just going to assume things, because no one's going to... The general average person, the quiet Australian, so to speak, is going to be voting no.
The silent majority.
is going to be voting no, because they're not going to take the time to look into it, because they have busy lives. They don't have a freaking political podcast to get out. But because they're not going to go and read other stuff, they're just going to see on the news a guy, these are all the problems. No one in the Labor Party is going to come out and address them the way that they should, and they deserve to be addressed. And they're going to be like, oh, well, there's all these issues and no one's presenting a solution to me, so I'm going to be voting no. And it's really sad, and I'm really quite disappointed in Labor for this mess up.
What they've done.
Yeah.
Because it's almost like they've assumed the goodwill of the Australian people.
Yeah, definitely.
And
no, you go this time.
Okay. They've assumed the goodwill of the Australian people, and they've rushed in with a referendum. I mean, they should have quite easily just looked at the history of how difficult it is for referendums to pass, how stigmatized referendum questions are, how binary the choice is.
Yeah.
It's and again, I this whole thing of the kind of no campaign scare campaign of if you don't know, vote no. It's to counter that stuff. You really do need to come out strong and say no.
And say something.
This is it.
Yeah, exactly.
And as I pointed out before, the whole if you don't know, vote no. I can't put this enough. It's based off the wrong premise. That you don't need to. It's not about putting forward the whole intricate details of what the voice is. That's going to be sorted through Parliament. And I know that sounds weird. But it is. That's how democracy works. That's not. That's the Parliament. That's what Parliament's for. And it is legitimate. It's sovereign. That's what it's there for. That's how our Constitution works. It's not the Constitution not working. It's the Constitution working, in my view.
Because I would have a guess. If you asked 90% of Australians, do you know what the actual paragraph? Have you read the actual paragraph that's going to be added to the Constitution is? They would say no, and they should. They shouldn't have to. The average person shouldn't be needing to look into these things as much. And because the question's so basic, it leaves a lot of questions. And which kind of leads me on to the final point I would like to make is why have they gone with such a basic question? And I think Labor is scared because I think it was the last referendum that went through, which was about
1999.
Yeah, should Australia become a republic, had this really detailed question, including like, if Australia is to become a republic, something like there would be a prime minister and a president, and the president would be the representative and the prime minister, all that sort of stuff.
2/3 of the Senate would have to vote on whether the president is this, and it offered two different scenarios of how it would function.
Yeah. And when people were asked why they voted against it, they all looked to different little minute issues within it they didn't like. Yeah. So Labourers thought, kind of in a rushed decision on how we're going to do this, okay, let's just make it super simple then. And it's backfired on them pretty dramatically.
And this is, again, what I was hinting a little bit at before with Brexit and the problem of referendums. This is the problem with referendums, is they're so hard to frame in regards to being too simple, too complicated, too binary, too susceptible to being taken over by scare tactics. So people have to be careful.
Yes.
And Albo seems to have more or less fallen into this trap. And it's if it does fail.
Yeah.
I don't know if it does fail. It'll be interesting to see if another referendum gets off the ground again, or what actually happens.
It's going to be harder the second time, surely. Yeah.
Looking at New Zealand, looking at Canada, even looking at, I was looking at Taiwan and what they've done for their indigenous populations. Australia is honestly miles behind the national kind of point at where we should be in regards to reconciliation in a constitutional framework.
Is there anything else you wanted to talk about, Will?
Not really. I would really appreciate people writing in as much as they possibly can.
You can message us on Instagram, Facebook, the what's it called? The email's in the description. We will actually be checking it. And if we get enough questions, we might even do a full follow-up episode to this one.
I would quite happily do that. We could do a follow-up, perhaps discussing the results, and then also discussing the questions put in.
That sounds like a good idea, actually. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Well,
because this is the defining. I don't know. What is the actual atmosphere in Australia at the moment, Tiago? Obviously, I have no idea. But is it like you go into the city centre of Perth and there is a kind of buzz? Has there been protest groups walking around? Are there signs out on the streets? What's the feeling?
It's definitely. It feels like a big thing that's going to happen. There is a lot of anger in the air, I feel, from both sides. And this is a point that I wanted to make at the beginning of the discussion. People labelling people that are voting no as racist, people that are labelling people voting yes as naive or stupid. I think it's quite, and as I said, it's a bit of a fustercluck or whatever I said, because it's just this kind of really toxic debate at the moment that I don't think it needs to be. And a lot of, angry protests and signs and freaking show bags that tell you to vote no and all that sort of stuff. So it does feel big, not big in a positive way though, which I think is a real shame. At a time we should probably be celebrating our democracy and all that sort of stuff. It's more just taking opportunities to whack the other side a little bit. But hey, that's politics.
Yeah, that's politics. So it will be quite interesting to see how this impacts the Albanese government and whatnot, and all of that good stuff.
Yeah.
But anyway, there we are. That's probably any final remarks from you, Tiago?
No, I just think everyone make sure you get out there and don't cop the fine if you don't vote. Get a sausage sizzle into you. Have a good time as much as you can, and just be a bit nicer to each other when having debates about this. Don't shut people down. Don't call them racist. Don't do any of that. Let's just have a good time. All right, Will. Any thoughts from you?
No, that's probably all of that.
All right.
Yeah.
The decision of one man to launch a wholly unjustified and brutal invasion of of Ukraine.
Up yours, woke moralists. We'll see who cancels who.